Hey everybody, and welcome back to the History Reader. In today's video we're doing the third installment for our read-along of James Holland's The War in the West, Volume 1. My copy is Germany Ascendant 1939 to 1941. It's got different titles depending on where in the world you are. I apologize firstly for this one being a little bit late. I basically just got busy. I usually record these things on like a Friday or Saturday, but I got busy and so I just thought I'd record it a bit later. I did sort of tease in the last video that part 3 is my favorite part of the book, and that's definitely true. I have now finished the book, and part 3 by far is the best part and some of my favorite writing about the Second World War that I've ever read. So I'm excited to get into this one. It is quite complex and there's a lot in here, so I'm not going to cover everything. If I were to sort of go into everything, we'd be here for 30 minutes, and I don't particularly enjoy watching 30-minute long videos of someone just talking, so I don't want to make one of those. So part 3 is titled The War in the Air and on the Sea, and part of the reason why this is my favorite part of the book is because the war in the air and on the sea is my favorite part of the war. Being a guy, I guess I just like ships and planes. I grew up really into planes and aviation in general, and so obviously something like the Battle of Britain was a massive interest of mine as a younger kid. And then more recently I've got really into ships. So yeah, this is just kind of the perfect part for me. But beyond that, James Holland does this really well. I believe this is kind of his, if not his specialty, it's his like area of interest. He's written several books on the Battle of Britain and he does it really well. The thing that makes his treatment of it so good is that he makes it abundantly clear that this air war, fighting a war in the air like this, has never really been done. Like, sure, there's been pockets of it, like in Spain there were pockets of it. There's been trials basically, but nobody really knows how to fight this type of engagement. We've been fighting continental land wars with armies for millennia in Europe and around the world, but we're talking about a European war here, and this is something that we've done over and over and over again, and there's countless books that have been written on it, and there's staff colleges, and we know how to do that. Like, sure, there's new technology every few decades and we have to readjust tactics, and that goes horribly wrong sometimes, like in the First World War where nobody really knows what to do. But this is a fundamentally new type of warfare, and Holland shows off that fact really well, and that everybody's kind of just scrabbling around trying to figure out what is the correct way of approaching this. How do we do it? So what does Holland get to? Basically, at the beginning of this part, where are we at? Germany is triumphant. That's what part 3 is called. So Germany have won in Norway, they've won in France. France has fallen, and we're at this point now, which is the sort of British folklore founding kind of point, that they're alone fighting the evil Nazi empire. We get in this part that actually that's not super true, but we'll get into that in a second. But that's where we're at. Britain is alone. There is this kind of impending invasion. Hitler does seem to be thinking about and actively wanting an invasion of Britain to happen. There is this sort of collection of barges, on the coast of Normandy. There are actively, it seems like this is going to happen, right? Later historiography has started to argue actually no, they wanted to sort of beat Britain into submission and force a signing of a peace treaty because kind of the invasion was never going to work. Maybe that's applying our perspective on things a little bit too much. Nobody thought that France was going to get knocked out as fast as it was, and so sure, maybe the invasion wouldn't have worked, but you'd be forgiven if you were in the Germans' position for thinking, well, we did one really unlikely thing, maybe we can do another really unlikely thing. And that's also, like, Hitler wasn't exactly the most sane person. So there is this situation where realistically Britain has to prepare to defend the island, and Germany is preparing to attack the island. And the way they're going to do this is, and the way they've realized they have to do this, is by getting air superiority. And that means defeating the RAF. And so we have the Luftwaffe and the RAF kind of clash over the English Channel and over Britain. And in that process, we have this learning of how do we fight in the air like this. Because when you're up in a Spitfire or a Hurricane or a ME-109 or whatever it is, it's not that easy to spot an enemy, and it's not that easy to hit an enemy. I mean, firing a rifle is hard enough. Like, you have to practice that a bunch to get good at it. This is why training of armies is so important. You could have a bunch of an army with a bunch of guys with rifles, and if they can't shoot straight, they're not going to be of much use. That gets a lot harder when you're up in an aeroplane and you've got to literally use the controls of the aeroplane to fight this guy, and you're pulling G's and you've got to manage all sorts of things. There's going to be turbulence. So actually hitting another plane is quite a difficult thing to do. Never mind spotting another plane. It is like you're way up in the air, and the other planes are going to be little dots that sort of appear over the horizon. So it's quite a difficult thing to do. The British, and this is what Holland focuses on a lot, Dowding, who heads up this fighter command, develops this system using the ground radars and the various communications to set up this like ground control system, so that he can detect when there's a Luftwaffe attack coming, whether that be bombers or fighters, and determine where they're going, and then get planes up in the air to go and intercept them. They can be given a vector, they can fly to it, intercept the planes, and fight it out. And this is like really revolutionary when you think about you're using radar, which is brand new technology. You're using quite complex communications. You've got to communicate this information. You've got to then put that into action, get pilots into planes up in the air. That means you have to have pilots available, they have to be trained, they have to be ready to go. You need to have planes available that need to be ready to go all the time. And that's not a simple thing to do. And so he figures out how to do this thing. And it's incredibly successful. You have these, you have the Luftwaffe ultimately gets fought back. And of course there are various reasons why the attack on Britain doesn't work. But this sort of innovation in the way they fought the war in the air is absolutely crucial. And I found that just fascinating reading about. and I want to get another one of Holland's books or find another book on that whole innovation because it's just fascinating. The other thing that comes in here is intelligence and the importance of intelligence, and that's not new. Sun Tzu in The Art of War talks about intelligence and how crucial it is. So it's not new, but we get to, again, we've explored this a little bit in the previous part, I think. But the structure of things like the squadrons matters, and understanding how that works matters to how you fight the war. And Germany just gets it wrong. They don't understand the way that the RAF is split up with coastal defense, etc. And so they don't put their resources into the right place. And that's just an intelligence failure. It's happened hundreds of times over the course of the history of war. They just get it wrong. And that's incredibly crucial. And then the other part of it is, and this is something that we start to get more into when we look at the war on the sea, and also in part 4, is just the fact that planes are rare. Like they're not, you have to build them, and when they get shot down, they're gone, and you have to build another one to replace it. And if the pilot also goes down with the plane, you have to get another pilot, and you have to train them. And I mean, flying is not an easy thing to do. And I think this is, like, again, probably a crucial part, which maybe doesn't get touched on quite enough here, but he does touch on it, like, briefly in parts, like alludes to it. But flying a plane is not an easy thing to do. I think driving a tank would be far simpler than flying a plane. Probably, like, sailing or commanding a ship is on par with learning to fly a plane. In fact, commanding a ship, I mean, there's hierarchies and stuff which get you up to, like, battleships and whatnot, but yeah, I mean, flying a plane is really hard to do, so you have to train the pilots, and that takes time. And so you lose a pilot, that's a significant sort of resource that you've lost. And this is where Britain does really well in learning how to manage their pilots and the resource that is those pilots, that Germany doesn't manage to do nearly as well. They have sort of more planes, less pilots in the British squadrons, so the planes are always available, they're always ready to go. Actually, there's more pilots, I think, from memory. There were more pilots in the British squadrons than there were in the German equivalent of squadron. I don't remember the German name. So they sort of have a bit more freshness. They also then kind of build in this leave every 2 weeks, I think it was. They, like, have time off to recover because flying is incredibly taxing. And so managing things, like, it's HR at the end of the day, managing these pilots' mental health, their physical health, their rest, becomes really crucial, especially as it becomes a kind of attritional battle, and Britain manages to stick out that attritional battle. The other part of that attritional battle is, of course, the war at sea, and this is actually where I got kind of my entry into reading about the Second World War. I read a book on the Battle of the Atlantic, and I was like, oh, like, the Second World War is actually so much more interesting than I thought it was. Before I was a First World War nut, I still really love the First World War and reading about the First World War, but I've come around to the Second World War because there are so many interesting things, so many interesting facets of how the war was fought. And the war at sea, particularly in the Atlantic, which is what we focus on mostly here, is so crucial. And while he talks about the war at sea, and we focus on things like the way the U-boats attacked and the convoy system that gets built up to protect the ships that were coming across from the United States with all the war material, we also then see this, how the supply lines are getting set up, how building things like the engines for the Spitfires, they send the plans over to America. You have Bill Knudsen, who starts to mobilize the American industry, and there's fascinating stuff in here about how they sort of wrote the contracts to remove the risk from American business and start moving towards, and we actually get this more in part 4, but moving the factories and expanding the factories towards building war material, and then over time dialing back the civilian production. It's so important. And really what the war at sea comes down to is, can Britain be supplied with enough food, with enough guns, engines, tanks, whatever, clothes, to continue to fight the war? And it really is quite simple. Dönitz and his U-boat arm want to stop that, and the way they stop that is by sinking transport ships, merchant ships. And the way Britain and the United States determine that they can supply Britain is by producing as much as they can in the US and then shipping it over and protecting those convoys with escort ships. Now in this period there is a vulnerability in the Atlantic because of this sort of impending invasion. So a lot of the ships that could be used as escorts are in the channel to kind of protect against this invasion that might happen. And we see that resolved towards the end and into part 4, where those ships eventually move into the Atlantic and kind of cut off the U-boat activities. But right in here, we right smack bang in the middle of the U-boat's happy time, where they're just sinking ship after ship after ship, and Britain kind of has no answer. And there's a famous quote, I don't remember it word for word, but Churchill says that the battle in the Atlantic is the crucial battle, and that's where the war is going to be won or lost. And that's the thesis really that Holland is building up over time in this book, is that if the Allies can supply enough war material to beat Germany on all the fronts that Germany is fighting on, they will win the war. And that is the crucial part. They don't have to outright beat Germany straight away. They have to hold Germany at bay long enough to stop them. And this is where we start to see in part 4, the war in North Africa is really about stopping Germany being able to supply themselves. If we can stop Germany supplying themselves and supply the Allies, the war will be won. And that's what Churchill means. And so we see in quite some detail how Roosevelt and the administration start to build the infrastructure to produce the war materials, and then we see how the convoy system gets built and Western Approaches Command gets built, and we don't actually get the kind of battle of the like the sinking of the Bismarck and all those things in here. That comes in part 4, but that's not actually really that important. At the end of the day, if the Bismarck had got into the Atlantic, maybe she would have caused some havoc, but at the end of the day, it's these U-boats that really become the crucial part of the war, and it's where Hitler makes a massive misstep in trying to build up the Kriegsmarine, the surface fleet. And what Holland comes back to again and again is Hitler has this continental mindset. And continental mindset means that he needs to have the surface fleet to fight Britain, and he doesn't give Dönitz the resources he needs to prosecute the war in the Atlantic. And there is a real argument to be made, and that's the argument I feel like Holland is building. He doesn't quite get there. He makes sort of a big gesture towards it in part 4. He doesn't quite get there yet. But if Hitler gives enough resources to Dönitz, the war takes a very different path. And I think that's really what we get here. He fails in the air and at sea here, Hitler does. One, because the Luftwaffe just was badly managed. Goering was not a good commander. He was not a particularly bright person. He just kind of happened to be up there in Hitler's inner circle, and that's what he wanted to do. He wasn't the person who should have been in charge of the Luftwaffe. And then Hitler also just doesn't give the resources to Dönitz that he needs. He focuses on building like the Bismarck and Tirpitz, and he allows Goering to kind of hold on to much of the other resources to build bombers and stuff. And yeah, I mean, the war probably would have taken a different turn had those two things gone differently. So that is part 3. There's a lot more in here. I haven't really scratched on stuff in the Mediterranean and the actual specifics about how the US war machine was built, but if you read it, you can get that. I don't want to be here for too long. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll link David's videos down below when they come out, and next week we'll be back for part 4. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.